Okay, good morning and welcome to today's breakout session, Global Trade, looking at the 2021 horizon. My name is Jonathan Hoff and I'm the CEO of Monte Vista Farming Company. I also chair the Almond Board's Technical and Regulatory Affairs Committee. Monte Vista is an almond processor and huller in Denair, California, and we ship to more than 20 countries worldwide. I'm also a third generation almond grower from Ripon, California, so seeing a profitable industry and unimpeded exports is important to me not only as an almond industry member, but also as a processor and a grower. I'm glad to moderate this presentation on both the global trade environment and what is on the horizon. If you had an opportunity to listen to this morning's general session, you heard a discussion by former USTR and USDA leaders about significant changes to the global business climate resulting from trade agreements, disputes, regulatory standards, COVID, and the intensifying consumer expectations we all face. This session will drill down more specifically into the trade picture that will impact the way almonds move into global markets. Almond production has continued to expand, so growing demand ahead of supply is essential if we expect to continue farming at a profitable level well into the future. Last year was our fourth straight record crop, and receipts this year are already 14% ahead of the same period last year. We set a record for total shipments last crop year, and the first 3 months of this crop year have also been record-setting, despite the incredible business challenges we face. But we know that uncertainty can be a major hurdle in key markets. Retaliatory tariffs in China increasing from 10% to 55%, port disruptions in India, the elimination of pesticide residue limits in Europe, the list goes on. We must remain focused on mitigating as many speed bumps as possible in order to retain and grow our access in key markets. We can anticipate some of these challenges, but clearly a lot is outside of our control. And as almonds become a bigger player in the export market, we also become a bigger target. So how the US approaches trade relationships and negotiations is essential for our industry. After all, we're the second largest ag export by value to the EU, second only to soybeans, and we're the largest ag export by value to both India and the United Arab Emirates. If California production continues to expand, maintaining diversity of export destinations by opening more markets and creating more demand will play a critical role in achieving the mission of moving the entire crop at economically sustainable levels. A quick note about how this session will work today. We've reserved about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Near the bottom of your screen, you'll see an orange icon. That's the area where if you click that button, you'll be able to enter questions for our presenter that we'll get to at the end of the session. We do not have the group chat feature enabled for this session, so I apologize for that. And now to give us some insights on what we should be watching on the trade horizon, I'm happy to introduce Julie Callahan. Julie was selected to be the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Agricultural Affairs in April, where she is overseeing efforts to promote the interest of U.S. agriculture and working to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to ag exports like almonds. Julie has been with USTR for 4 years, and before that worked in the Office of International Programs at the FDA. She has a tremendous understanding of pesticide and technical issues that are going to be driving factors for specialty crops like almonds. And with that, Julie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I wish we could all be meeting in person, but hopefully someday soon that will be possible. And in looking at the 2021 trade horizon, looking at the horizon really depends on where you're standing. So I wanted to give you first kind of an overview of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Our office sits within the White House, and our primary role is to develop trade policy and trade strategy. We negotiate with foreign governments, and we also engage very closely with other U.S. government agencies to execute our trade strategy. And we often rely on our regulatory partners across the U.S. government, particularly in implementing trade agreements. We also provide feedback to agencies on the domestic rules that U.S. government agencies publish to ensure consistency with U.S. trade obligations. And we also get involved in discussions with foreign governments on particular technical discussions where maybe the US government regulators aren't able to resolve differences, and where USTR input can be helpful, where we can engage strategically. Usually it's not on very specific trade concerns, very specific issues, but more when there's a systemic challenge with a country. So as I mentioned, we work with multiple US government agencies, each of which plays a role in agricultural trade, some directly and some indirectly. So from Customs and Border Protection, the Food Safety, Plant Health, and Animal Health regulatory agencies, development agencies, the USDA Foreign Ag Service, Environmental Protection Agency, the list goes on. And each US agency has a distinct mission. And from our perspective, what we see is that often these missions can be used in different ways by foreign governments, sometimes to create trade barriers. And that's where we generally try to engage with the US regulators, provide guidance where it's useful, and sometimes join in those discussions where we really need to address unjustified barriers that foreign governments may be trying to impose. So we also have a unique process that USTR runs. It's called the TPSC for short, the Trade Policy Staff Committee. And all US trade positions and negotiating positions are cleared across the US government. That's unique for the United States, and it actually helps us to have a very well-informed, well-rounded trade policy approach. And other governments often look to the United States as a model for how they could better inform their trade positions by incorporating input from all of the entities across the government. From Congress, we have our cleared advisors that we seek feedback as appropriate, and we have a very well-rounded, fulsome process in developing that trade strategy. So shifting to the landscape itself, the vast majority of the work that we do here at USTR could fall into two major types of trade barrier buckets. The first is the tariff barriers, where everyone's quite familiar with the impact on high tariffs on our ability to export agricultural products. But then an even bigger and more complicated bucket is the non-tariff barriers. Each of these types of barriers is very important for us to tackle, but it takes different types of engagement, and each kind of offers different types of trends and opportunities that I foresee for 2021 and beyond. In terms of the tariff negotiations, of course, USTR leads those negotiations. We work very closely with USDA, and we need to follow Trade Promotion Authority requirements. That requires us to seek feedback, as I mentioned, from Congress, from cleared advisors. It's a very well articulated set of requirements that USTR has under TPA. And you're probably familiar with the current two major activities that we're following TPA, the US-UK trade negotiation and the US-Kenya trade negotiation, both of which are ongoing. We had a third negotiation kind of in the hopper to begin, but did not launch, and that was with the European Union. Many of our stakeholders, including our Almond stakeholders, provided feedback to USTR on what you would like to see from an agreement eventually between the United States and the EU. Unfortunately, the EU did not agree to include agriculture in those discussions, and therefore the negotiations didn't progress. In 2021, we'll see. We would certainly be interested in working with the EU, but we'll see if they are willing and able to include agriculture in those discussions. And I will say, in terms of the non-tariff barriers, the array of USG agencies that gets involved in those discussions kind of mirrors the array and diversity of non-tariff barriers themselves. That will continue 2021 and beyond, because governments, foreign governments, will never cease to amaze me in the number and variety of non-tariff barriers that can be produced, and we tackle those as they come up. So USTR has a number of tools that we use in our bilateral engagement, whether it's, as I mentioned, negotiating a comprehensive trade agreement, such as the UK and Kenya agreements that are being negotiated now. Those can be used both to address current trade concerns and also to prevent trade barriers from being created in the future. Other ways that we negotiate with countries where maybe a full comprehensive trade agreement isn't yet appropriate, we have smaller bilateral agreements in place with a number of countries, including trade and investment framework agreements and other types of agreements and bilateral partnerships where, again, we can address systemic trade concerns and other barriers. And we certainly use the leverage of our regulatory partnerships where we can. And truly, the best solution for resolving STCs, as we call them, specific trade concerns, is to get at them from the technical point, to have the regulators engage with their regulatory counterparts to encourage countries to adopt standards that are based on science and based on risk assessment. So where we can, we work with our regulatory agencies to try to resolve things before USTR needs to get engaged directly. And I'll say a third very large area where USTR engages is in the multilateral space, whether that's in the World Trade Organization or partnering with our USG partners in other international organizations, whether it's the United Nations, the FAO, a number of multilateral organizations where the US engages that are very important to our agricultural equities. So taking a look back, before we look forward, I wanted to look back very briefly on three major bilateral agreements that entered into force in 2020. And those agreements will certainly influence our work moving forward in 2021 as well. The first was the Japan Trade Agreement, which entered into force on January 1st of 2020. That covers 90% of our agricultural exports, about $7.2 billion in US ag. And this agreement was particularly critical to ensure that US agriculture receives the preferential market access that our competitors have with Japan. The second major agreement of 2020 was the US-China Phase 1 agreement, which entered into force on Valentine's Day, February 14th. And that agreement contains some specific reforms that China agreed to implement, as well as some purchasing commitments. So we've been tracking that closely since entry into force, and will continue to do so through 2021. The third, of course, is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, entered into force July 1st. And again, that's a comprehensive free trade agreement which made improvements to the existing NAFTA. Now, those three agreements together overhauled our relationship with our four largest trading partners, which represents about half of US agricultural exports. But I will say, all of the hard work that went into getting those agreements over the finish line was really the beginning. Negotiations themselves don't eliminate non-tariff barriers magically, and so we need to work with our FTA partners to make sure that they first meet the commitments that they agreed to on paper, and then that countries don't do additional things in the future that would impact adversely our ability to export agricultural products. So it's an ongoing process. And I'll just give you a quick example with the China Phase 1 agreement. We have been meeting weekly with an agricultural subcommittee that includes US government agencies. We have those weekly meetings where we check in on implementation, if there are any challenges faced, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, USDA, other agencies in getting China to meet its commitments. And then We report again weekly to our deputy USTR on any issues that we need to elevate to his attention. And I will say this isn't just for agriculture, it's for all of the chapters of the China Phase 1 agreement. There are also monthly calls that we have with China to raise any concerns that we have. Those are conducted at the assistant USTR level. We have quarterly vice minister level calls, and then we have biannual minister level calls. So that's just to give you kind of an overview that you might read about an agreement that is, approved and enters into force. That's really just the beginning of the work that takes place within USTR and across the interagency to ensure that those countries are actually coming through with the tangible commitments that they have agreed to meet. So looking forward to the rest of 2020 and 2021, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of work with China that's ongoing. We have work with Canada and Mexico that will continue. We certainly have our eyes on the FTA negotiations with the UK and Kenya. And I'll say, just as a sidebar, FTA negotiations are comprehensive. So ag is one element. I'm a bit biased, so I think ag is the most important. But if you look at USMCA as an example, there are 34 chapters of that agreement. There are 16 side letters. There's additional annexes. It covers intellectual property, financial services, telecommunications, anti-corruption, environment, labor. There's a very long list of chapters, and therefore the FTA negotiations themselves really are sort of like a team sport. And all of the offices of the USTR are involved in the negotiation. We've got the lead negotiators as well as lead negotiators of each discrete chapter. And the agriculture office, my office, leads on agricultural market access, the agricultural tariff negotiations, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which is a separate chapter, the agriculture rules of origin, and then we work closely with the leads that cover chapters such as technical barriers to trade and good regulatory practices and others. So it's really a multifaceted endeavor, and therefore it does take time. We are eager to wrap both the UK and Kenya up expeditiously. I will say that with the UK, they're a relatively small market. It's less than $2 billion. In fact, total, that is for agriculture specifically, and total ag exports to the UK, just to give you an example, are the same as just almond exports to the EU in 2019. So 2019, we exported about $1.8 billion of almonds to the EU, but we exported about $1.8 billion of total ag to the UK. So it's a relatively small market. However, this agreement could have larger ripple effects. In particular, we're encouraging the UK to follow science and risk assessment in its ag standards, in its food safety standards, its plant health standards, animal health standards. And so far, we've had 5 rounds, 5 formal rounds of discussion. However, we have been engaging with the UK for over 3 years since the UK population voted to exit the EU. So those discussions really have been taking place for a long time. We do have a long way to go before we can reach an agreement. But again, that's certainly front of mind for me in the near term. Likewise with Kenya, that negotiation launched on July 8th. And I will say we do have a long way to go to reach a reciprocal, mutually beneficial agreement. And we'll see how far we can get with that in 2021. And I'll mention, in the background of all of these trade negotiations is the understanding that TPA, or Trade Promotion Authority, is authorized only through July 1st of 2021. And so it's unclear whether that may be renewed or not. If you walk back from that date, if we wrapped up a negotiation in the early spring, there's a chance that it could be finalized within the TPA timeline, but we'll see. Again, you can't really rush a comprehensive trade agreement. So we are pushing as expeditiously as we can, but again, we also won't minimize the importance of getting an agreement that meets the expectations of all of our stakeholders and meets the high gold standard that we set with the USMCA. So as I mentioned, in terms of China, USMCA and others, ensuring that countries deliver on what they committed to in FTAs will certainly be a theme in 2021 and beyond. Some of the foundational work that we've conducted with Brazil, for instance, you probably heard just this week about a phase 1 agreement with Ecuador that was just signed, and we'll certainly be working with our trading partners in 2021 and beyond to build on the foundation that we've set and continue to try to resolve some outstanding specific trade concerns. We have some import licensing issues in Ecuador, for instance. We will keep all of those STCs front of mind as we work with our trading partners moving forward. Southeast Asia, Latin America, a number of countries where we have specific issues that we need to address, those will continue and span. They span from year to year until we get the issue resolved, basically. And again, it will be an important time for us to continue our multilateral coalition building. And that's in Geneva, in the World Trade Organization, and also across international organizations. It's an area where we've built very strong partnerships in terms of food safety, plant health, and animal health standards, ensuring that science standards are based on science and risk assessment. We have a very large and growing coalition that supports our positions in Geneva, and we will continue to build on that moving forward. So one trading partner I haven't mentioned is the European Union, other than in the context of our trade negotiations, which we weren't able to launch. As our Almond stakeholders know, there's a number of trade barriers that we face with the EU, whether it's high tariffs or some non-tariff barriers that prevent US agricultural producers from accessing the EU market. The US-EU relationship is extremely important to us, but it's also highly unbalanced. It's our major ag trading partner deficit is with the EU. In 2019, we had an $18 billion deficit. That's really unheard of if you look at our other trade numbers across the world. That $18 billion deficit is really outstanding, and it's really, in our view, the result of a number of tariff and non-tariff barriers that prevent U.S. agricultural producers from accessing the market. If you look at the ability of U.S. agriculture to compete worldwide, we have a very high ability to compete where we have a level playing field. And so we will continue to press the EU in 2020 to address the unjustified barriers that restrict our access and to continue to build markets for U.S. agricultural producers. I will say one major challenge that we are facing now and that will continue to evolve in 2021 and beyond is shaping the narrative around agricultural sustainability and food systems. So we're working in USTR and also with the US government interagency to really shape the narrative and promote and protect US ag interests in multilateral settings. The United States is investing significantly in innovative practices, how to improve sustainability, how to improve soil health. Can we use fewer inputs and increased yield? to lower our carbon footprint, be more environmentally sustainable? And how do we convey this effectively in the face of some misinformation and misunderstanding that we're seeing, whether it's in bilateral discussions or sometimes in multilateral settings, where some of the messaging equates what's called big agriculture with being not sustainable? And often the term big agriculture is used as a synonym of US agriculture. So there's really a lot of misperception about what's taking place in the United States in terms of our innovation and our push to improve sustainability and be good environmental stewards. So we really need to have a concerted effort, both from the private sector and also from the US government, to ensure that our messaging really reflects what's taking place on the ground in the United States, and that other countries can model their approach after what's being done. Tackling discriminatory practices is sort of the bread and butter of what USTR does. And it's fairly straightforward when it's truly a discriminatory practice. One issue that we're also grappling with is, what can we do when countries are taking actions that actually are harming their own ag sector, as well as the ability of US agricultural producers to access the market? That's much more complicated, and it's something that we're very much grappling with as we see certain countries that are adopting either standards or regulatory approaches that their own farmers are concerned about. And how do we approach those countries? Sometimes it can be that US producers partner with their own counterparts in foreign governments to try to work through those private sector routes to influence change. But it really is a challenge for USTR when there aren't explicitly discriminatory actions that target the United States. It's more just a misguided policy approach that we need to encourage countries to shift their approach and their process. And I will say, in terms of sustainability and the ability of US agriculture to be resilient and to remain strong in global trade, I think COVID-19 has really highlighted both some unexpected challenges with the supply chains, but also it's ultimately demonstrated the resiliency and strength of US agricultural producers and the US food production and distribution system. And so we want to incorporate that as well into our messaging moving forward. So again, other countries can see the United States as the model and an aspirational role model for their own domestic approaches. So what we'll be doing at USTR, advancing a proactive strategic approach to our engagement on the bilateral and multilateral fronts. Where we can, we're going to define the narrative, not let other countries or other organizations define the narrative, but really focus on the strength of our system and why other countries should join the United States in championing the use of science and innovation in our agricultural sector. Also promoting access to tools and technologies for farmers to support farmer livelihoods. That's been a very strong message from USDA and USTR, and we'll continue that moving forward. And again, coalition building, whether it's in the World Trade Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, APEC, and others, to ensure that US agricultural interests are protected and promoted. And in all of these endeavors, certainly stakeholder feedback is really essential. We rely on all of our cleared advisors, on our ag stakeholders to provide the fact-based information on the ground, what you're seeing, what's happening with trading partners, and what's challenging and what's working. All of that information is incorporated into our positions as we move forward. And so we will continue to rely on that stakeholder feedback moving forward. In addition, anytime stakeholders have new approaches and innovative approaches, whether it's an approach to sustainability criteria, new innovative approaches that you're adopting, all of that information also is very important as we create our talking points and move forward with countries so that we can understand what's really happening in the real world, not just in Washington, D.C. So again, when something's a problem or when it's something that's working right, I think that kind of feedback will be essential moving forward. So I don't want to talk too long because I know we want to keep enough time for questions and answers. So I'm going to pause there and see if you have any specific questions.
Well, thanks very much, Julie, for those comments. It's clear that there's a lot going on in the world of global trade, and I'd like to thank you personally for being willing to be on the front lines negotiating on our behalf. And so with that, I'll open it up to some questions, and we have some in the question section here. This one is from Alicia Rockwell. She says, Julie, thank you for joining the Yemen community today. What is the strategy for EU negotiations? TTIP was challenging before, and now EU has put forth their assertive Green Deal initiatives.
Well, thanks very much for that question, Alicia. And certainly the EU farm to fork policies and the Green Deal, it would fall under that category that I just mentioned, where it's very difficult to grapple with a domestic policy issue in a foreign government where the policy may actually harm the domestic producers as well as U.S. producers' ability to export to the region or to the country. And so in terms of the farm to fork policies, how they roll out is still to be seen. So what we have been focusing on most is defining the narrative from the U.S. lens and making sure that we are conveying all of the things that are taking place in the United States that are actually very proactive, whether it's keeping carbon in the soil, using less water, using fewer inputs, and not really boiling it down to a strict numerical target. As I'm sure you've seen in the EU farm to fork strategy, there are certain targets that are, we'll decrease this by X% and we'll decrease this by X%. And when you get into the details of what that actually means, it's difficult to tease out how that will actually relate to the ultimate objectives of the policy approach writ large. So that is something that we're watching very closely and trying to tease out the details, because at this point, there's a lot of very high-level messaging, but we don't really know how that's going to play out on the ground. So we're watching closely, not overreacting where things aren't fully fleshed out yet, but certainly we understand the concern from stakeholders that have read some of these high-level messaging that looks like it may be detrimental for U.S. ag market access.
Great, thank you, Julie, for that answer. Have another question from Ryan Bailing about China. He says, I read that China is not living up to the phase one thus far in terms of money spent on agricultural products. Do you think that they will rebound and buy more to reach their promised number of $36.6 billion? And if not, what measures are in place to hold them responsible?
Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And, the China phase one deal is, there's really two elements that we're following very closely in the Agriculture Office. One, of course, is the purchases, and that does get a lot of press and a lot of attention, in part because there are specific numbers that people are seeking assurance that they're going to meet those numbers. Another very large part of the Phase 1 agreement, which is critical in my perspective, is the systemic commitments that China made in terms of its regulatory measures. So if you look at the agreement itself, Chapter 3 on agriculture includes all of those systemic commitments. China has actually lived up to those commitments across the board. There are certainly some that have not been met, but the vast majority actually have been met. And this is extremely important from my perspective because getting China to change its regulatory approaches has been a very intractable exercise for us for a long time. And in the Phase 1 agreement, there are specific commitments that China made, whether it's allowing additional U.S. Facilities to be listed for export to China, whether it's their approach to high path avian influenza and other animal diseases, opening the market for different U.S. agricultural products. There are a number of areas where we have been able to exceed in some ways our own expectations of what could be done with China pre-Phase 1 agreement. Some of the issues that we were able to address and that have been addressed actually have come to fruition. I will say on the purchases side, there are a number of challenges in that respect. You know, the Phase 1 agreement, like I mentioned, entered into force in mid-February. As you know, no one could have predicted at that time what would happen to the US and the world in March and moving forward. So there's certainly been some challenges across global agricultural trade due to COVID-19. We're not seeing that as an excuse not to meet the purchasing commitments, and we're tracking those commitments on a weekly basis. We report those numbers to Ambassador Lighthizer every single week. And so I don't want to, I cannot emphasize enough how closely those numbers are being watched. And our expectation is that China will ultimately meet the purchasing commitments that extend from 2020 through 2021. And China has conveyed to us that they intend to meet those commitments as well. So granted, I'll acknowledge that they've gotten off to a slow start, but we have never used that slow start as an excuse not to ultimately meet the purchasing commitments.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question here, do you see NGOs gaining more voice? And what are the compelling arguments that industry can help USTR craft in these negotiations?
That's a great question. I think, you know, all of our stakeholders have a voice. When we enter into trade negotiations, we have a process that we have a statutory requirement to open comments up for the general public, for NGOs, for the private sector, for foreign governments. We have an open process that we post to the Federal Register and allow comments from all stakeholders. So that voice is important. And we do listen to both the civil society organizations as well as our private sector stakeholders when we're entering into agreements. I wouldn't say that the voice is getting louder or changing its volume, but there are certainly some areas where we see challenges with some misinformation, where we try to set the record straight. One big area, as I mentioned, is in this food systems, sustainability, food security, food choice. There's a number of areas that are very important to a number of organizations and groups. And we really need to get the policy decisions right. We care very much, as you know, as a government on food security around the world. We want to make sure that that issue is not sort of conflated with food choice and some of the other issues that come into play at the same time. So our main objective when we get into a multinational arena, whether it's the Food and Agriculture Organization or others, is to ensure that the U.S. position reflects our science-based approach to regulation and our approach to maintaining agricultural production in a sustainable way and promoting food security worldwide. So it has not been easy. And again, we tackle misinformation and take that as one of our most important roles in the international space.
Great, thanks so much. Another question from Victor Tao here. He says, hi, Julie. You talked about non-tariff barriers impacting ag exports. Can you go into more detail about what these non-tariff barriers are and which ones are most negatively impacting trade?
Boy, how much time do we have? So the non-tariff barriers that we face most in the agriculture space have to do with sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So those are the regulations that cover food safety, animal health, and plant health. There can also be non-tariff barriers that affect agriculture in what's called technical barriers to trade, and that's usually in types of certification, whether certification bodies are required to certify different types of information on labels and other issues that aren't related to safety, but just relate to sort of the technical labeling type of issues that countries may require. Now, on the sanitary and phytosanitary side, which we call SPS, those measures depends on the product itself. This is one area where it's very close to my heart. Many of you know that my background is chemistry. So all of these SPS measures, many of them are very technical in nature. A lot of them have to do with whether it's a pesticide residue level, a contaminant level, veterinary drug standards, or it can have to do with microbiological standards. So all of these are on the food safety side. They could also have to do with plant pests, where countries understandably don't want to have non-native pests that could harm their own domestic agricultural production to be introduced into their country. So they put in place certain measures to ensure that plant pests are not imported along with the commodities. Likewise, on the animal health side, countries understandably want to prevent animal diseases from being imported into their country. So on the SPS side, all of these regulations are very much required and needed, and we support them. We have one of the strongest food safety systems in the world. Our Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service ensures that U.S. agriculture is protected, that we don't import invasive species, animal diseases, plant diseases. And so all of these measures are critically important. However, many times foreign governments use the measures to create non-tariff barriers that will favor their country over another country. And what we often explain is, if you take the United States, if California was one country and Florida was a country, I guarantee there would be SPS problems between California and Florida, and both would be trying to keep each other's products out for various reasons. But given that we have a federal government that sets the regulatory standards, our federal regulations can be applied across the United States and allow growers to produce crops in all of the states, regardless of climate, pest pressure, consumption patterns. All of those are taken into account when we develop a national standard, so that if a certain state has a higher pest pressure, they can follow the label on a pesticide label and prevent those pests from destroying their crops, while also ensuring that you as consumers don't have unsafe pesticide residues on their food. So the regulatory agencies in the United States take these roles very seriously, protect consumers, ensure that farmers have the tools and technologies that they need, while also maintaining one consistent regulatory standard. When it comes country to country, you don't have that necessity to create one standard. So sometimes the standards differ. It isn't that one is safer than the other, it's that the baseline data that went into that regulatory decision was different. So when the standards are different, the way countries implement those standards can actually create major trade problems, irrespective of the safety. And so that's where USTR works with our regulatory agencies to try to engage countries from that regulatory standpoint to try to come up with a solution that will protect the country's agricultural system if they're concerned about a plant or animal health issue, or protect their consumers if it's a food safety issue. So I know I didn't give you the number one, because there's no number one. Each minuscule trade barrier is not minuscule for the producer that is tackling it. So each one is very important here at USTR.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. And Craig Dewar asks, as an industry, we've had extreme difficulty enforcing signed contractual agreements in India. I know that USTR has been involved with these discussions in the past. Does there look like there will be any progress on this front?
Well, thank you for that question. And India is certainly top of mind for a number of stakeholders, Almonds and others. It's a country that has a very highly protected ag sector, as many of you know. And we have been engaging with India very closely over several years, trying to make headway and address both some of the SPS issues that I mentioned, but also across the board, the barriers that are put in place by India are really monumental and have been very difficult to address. We are still working on it. I know that's not particularly great news just to hear, we're working on it, but we are, we haven't been able to reach an agreement. You've probably seen in the press over the last year, there were a few times that various politicians in India made public statements saying that they were ready to sign a deal with the United States. But Ambassador Lighthizer has engaged directly with the foreign minister to try to make headway. And we haven't given up. It's just a matter of whether India will be able to provide to us the market access that would be meaningful across our stakeholders. So it's still a work in progress.
Well, I think I can echo Craig's comments and that question and saying that is definitely something that's really important to the almond industry. So go get them. And with that, I think that's all that we have time for this morning. Julie, I want to thank you so much for being willing to not only be with us here this morning and talk about the future of trade, but also for everything that you and the folks in your office are doing to help us maintain and grow our access to these key and critical markets. Anybody listening, if you have additional questions, please visit the Almond Board's virtual booth. You can ask questions there. To those of you who posted questions that I wasn't able to get to, I'm sorry, but thank you all so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks again, Julie.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.